Hi, I'm Stewart Spinks and welcome to episode 395 of my podcast, Beekeeping Short and Sweet. Wouldn't you just know it, on the one day I really needed to carry out some inspections, it's rained. It was cold and it just kept raining all morning. The result? Next day, swarming. Beekeeping Short and Sweet, a beekeeping podcast for the inquisitive beekeeper with a short attention span. A beekeeper, in fact, just like me. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Another exciting early season beekeeping week with lots happening to affect the workload of us beekeepers, and that means that life's never boring at this stage of the season. Most of the season is necessarily driven by keeping one eye on the weather, and the last week is very much a good example of this. We've been desperate for some rain here in Norfolk. The ground has dried up very quickly after the winter, and we've had very little rainfall to speak of. Being a beekeeper, I would ask for rain overnight, please. If it could stop by maybe 9 a.m. at the latest, it would allow me to get out and carry on our inspections of our bee colonies uninterrupted within the timetable of my choosing. The very important reason for wanting rain is to continue the lovely nectar flow that we've enjoyed recently, it being a very strong flow this year. Most easily seen when you carry out an inspection, tilt the frame, and you suddenly see lots of nectar dripping out of the cells quite freely. Well, last week we finally got some rain, but it was daytime rain, and being spring, it was still quite cold rain. In fact, it was very cold rain. I have on occasion inspected colonies while it's been raining, but mainly in the summer when it's a warm rain and it doesn't adversely affect the colony, too severely. Cold spring rain can very quickly chill a colony, causing the brood nest area to lose its heat very quickly and chilling brood rapidly. And of course, the bees don't like it either, so they're likely to try to chase you away from the hive. On this particular day, I had intended visiting two apiaries, the allotment apiary and the farm apiary. I needed to carry out limited inspections, but still really needed to get into the colonies in some instances because they were destined to be sold as nucleus colonies, and this was their last quality control check, if you like. Rain-delayed inspections can be devastating at this time of the year, ultimately ending up in a swarmed colony, particularly for anyone who's stuck with a weekly inspection routine, maybe on a specific day of the week, because of work, family, or other commitments. So we sat in the truck, dashed out, checked a couple of colonies, and dashed back into the truck, got the video camera out, then a minute or so later put it away again. It was, I guess quite comical and would have seemed funny to the unknowing eye, but for me it was very frustrating. We did get to check on the colonies we needed to at the allotment apiary, but alas, couldn't shoot a video. But the site visit that should have taken no more than an hour had eaten up around 4 hours of my day. This necessarily meant a slight change in plans, so I dropped the inspections at the farm apiary, being too far to drive and inspect with so many colonies on site, and headed to the fishing lakes apiary to carry out limited inspections there, again on nucleus colonies that required final checks before being sold. By the time late afternoon arrived, we were bathed in gloriously warm sunshine, and you would have wondered what all the fuss was about. But I was a day late for my farm inspections, and what effect would that have on my routine, and more importantly, on the bees? The following morning, we stopped off at the paddock to collect a few boxes and doing my usual look around the hedge line, I spotted yet another swarm. Interestingly, it was hanging in almost the same position as the previously collected swarm that I recently showed on video, the one where Steph helped shake them into the box. I do find that swarms will sometimes use the same or very close to the same location. This is when they first leave their hive and settle before moving on. This one appeared to be a cast swarm from one of the nukes. A cast swarm is one that has a virgin queen in it, usually as a result of the beekeeper, that's me, missing a swarm cell and leaving more than one sealed queen cell after a colony has swarmed. They were quickly dealt with and shaken into a 6-frame nuke box, so not the biggest cluster of bees by any stretch of the imagination, but actually not tiny. I expect them to grow quickly if the queen can get out and mate successfully in the next week, and with the amount of time still available, I may even get them into a full-size hive and benefit from a small crop of honey from them over the summer nectar flow period. Fingers crossed on that one. This last swarm collection illustrates nicely why I try to get into a swarmed colony a couple of times before the new queen emerges. I'm trying to be absolutely sure that I've removed all queen cells that the colony could possibly use to swarm again and again and again with. The often repeated method I hear some beekeepers suggest, which I think is flawed, is once a colony has swarmed, check for queen cells and remove all but one. Then you can leave them until that queen has emerged and mated, so maybe 3 or even 4 weeks later. The main issue here is that colonies are very adept at producing queen cells from egg all the way through to quite old larvae. And of course, colonies will swarm while there are still eggs in cells. So if your timing of the inspection is just after a swarm has flown the hive, the colony, although already probably well provisioned with several queen cells, can easily produce more if I, the beekeeper, goes in and removes all but one. It's the same situation you might find with an artificial swarm. So the best advice is the same as that technique. Go back into the colony several days later, maybe 5 to 7 days or so, and check once more for queen cells. So following on from collecting that smaller swarm at the paddock, we headed over to the farm apiary, and just as we arrived, a swarm was coming out of one of the hives, and we watched it as it disappeared over the hedge. Sometimes it feels like they're determined to work against you. Obviously that's not the case, it's just nature at work. But I think at the time I said something like, "Give me a break," or maybe words similar to that I couldn't possibly repeat here. In actual fact, this apiary is doing just fine. Yes, we did suffer a few swarms from a couple of weeks ago, but the honey production has been great. We're still adding boxes for honey, mainly because the hawthorn is delivering a very nice nectar flow this year, but the oilseed rape at this location is now finished. The bright yellow fields have turned green, and that's it done for another year. I suspect we may well get another super of honey from some of these colonies, such is the continuing flow of nectar, and the change in temperament that we often find at the end of the oilseed rape nectar flow just isn't there this year. It's an odd and sometimes surprising feature of the last days of the spring nectar flow. Colonies that are totally docile and absolutely a pleasure to inspect turn into aggressive and following bees. Sometimes it can be put down to poor beekeeping skills in inspection techniques, for instance, insufficient use of the smoker, or a crash-bang-wallop approach to inspecting. But the change is very noticeable on those quieter colonies, so do take time to take a look around and see if the end of the spring nectar flow is the cause of this sudden aggressive behaviour. One notable success in amongst the swarming activity is a colony that I would call number 1 on the concrete track at the farm. Those of you who have followed the videos recently will remember the worrying signs of dead bees piled up in a heap just outside the hive entrance, and the seemingly low number of bees within the brood box. There's an updated video out on Patreon just today if you want to see what's happening with them, but for here and now, it's all good news, because in recent weeks, they've grown. They've grown so well that they've filled 2 supers with honey and continue to need more space. Actually, one addendum to the video is that when we had finished filming, I actually put 2 more supers of drawn comb onto that hive, so it'll be interesting to see how they progress. But I'm really pleased with how they have turned out. They've done just so well, because at one point they did look in a very sorry state and could easily have collapsed and died. It would be quite remarkable if they were able to produce 3 or even 4 supers of honey and show no signs of swarming as we head into mid-May. For many of you, the spring will have brought a lovely honey crop, and your super frames will be heavy, full of deliciously tasty honey, and fully capped ready for extraction. But what about that frame of honey that is not yet capped? How can you tell if it's ready to extract? Ideally, you'd need a refractometer. It's a simple piece of equipment that shows the water content of your honey. The threshold that most beekeepers tend to aim for is below 20% water content. Get the honey below that level, and it's very difficult, if not impossible, for yeasts and moulds to grow and develop. Watch the last video for a simple shake test to get a broad view as to whether the honey is ripe enough to remove from the hive. Fundamentally, ripe honey tends not to drip or drop out of cells when the frame is held in a horizontal position and given a few sharp shakes. Do this on both sides, and if no honey drops onto the frames below, you're pretty much good to take it away. Back at the workshop, we're finding it hard to keep up with all the frames and foundation that we need right now. I just can't make up frames fast enough, and that's both our Langstroth hives and the 14 by 12 nucleus colonies. The main reason for this, well, there are a couple of reasons, but I guess the main reason is that we have suffered, if that's the right word, we have suffered a lot of swarming, particularly from the overwintered nukes. They've grown so strongly that running out of space has congested them, and they've disappeared over the hedge line. We now find ourselves in a position, maybe with a virgin or newly mated queen in these colonies, and that's great. These queens, if successfully mated and laying, will go on to head up summer honey production colonies in the case of the Langstroth nukes, or be available for sale as spring nukes for the 14 by 12 size frames. The bigger challenge in these nukes is something that I would term being honey-bound. This is where a colony has maybe swarmed, had a virgin queen emerge from a sealed queen cell, and is either newly mated or about to take her mating flight. In the time between the swarm leaving the hive with the old queen and the moment we await our newly mated queen to start laying eggs, the workers have no need to tend to eggs and young larvae because there are none. Over that small period of time when the queen stops laying, which you could simply say is an 8-day period, that being the time it takes from an egg being laid through to being capped, generally, after that period, there's nothing for these workers to do. So, cells can be cleaned out, other duties can be performed, such as guard duty, honey processing, but emerging worker brood means the adult population increases rapidly, freeing up both empty cells for use and older workers to go out and forage. Now we have a nectar flow happening right now, and the result is the brood box, empty of any eggs or young larvae, very often gets filled up with nectar, which in turn is processed into honey and in some cases gets capped as stored food, particularly in the outer frames of the brood nest. It's interesting just to point out also that at the point that the colony has swarmed, if you haven't spotted that it's swarmed, you might just see lots and lots of nectar in cells that you would have supposed the queen would have laid eggs into. If you see a combination of no eggs and lots of nectar in brood frames, then that's another good sign that things might not be exactly as you want them. Anyway, the effect of this is that our brood nest area that might have covered 7 or 8 or even more frames prior to the swarming event now has maybe 3 or 4 frames that might have room for a small brood area in the middle, but still being filled up with nectar and honey, so it's getting smaller all the time. The new queen starts to lay her eggs, but with so little space, everything slows down. They might not necessarily decide to swarm immediately, if at all, but the brood nest area is restricted, and several weeks down the road, your summer foraging force is actually tens of thousands of bees short of where they ought to be, because there hasn't been enough space for the queen to lay her eggs in 6 or more weeks previously. So what can we do about this? Well, it's a great opportunity to remove a couple of frames and replace them with foundation. You might need to replace more, but I would advocate removing 1 at a time, 2 at a time, and remove all of the frames filled with stores that are towards the outside of the box. But don't remove all of them. If the weather turns cold and rainy, as it can at this time of the year, you might inadvertently starve your bees. 1 or 2 frames each week should be more than manageable for most healthy colonies, even if they've swarmed, and it gives your new laying queen cells in which to get active. My personal selection criteria for removing brood frames is to start with the oldest, nastiest looking frames, maybe the outside frames that have been stuck to the sidewall of the brood box and has had the comb torn as you've tried to remove it. I don't simply put the frame of foundation in its place. I position the foundation next to the brood nest area, or where I hope the brood nest area will be, and ideally next to a frame where the food stores in the top corners of the frame have been capped over. If it isn't capped over, I often find the bees will extend the comb in the older frame rather than draw out the foundation to meet the existing comb, resulting in a large bulge of comb on that old frame, and that just makes for very awkward removal without damaging it. If you're lucky enough to have reasonably fresh and undamaged comb in those honey-bound frames, you can save them and use them for adding to colonies that maybe are a little short on food, or they can be used in splits or nukes. Just bear in mind the health of the original colony that the frame has come from. Please make sure you're not transferring disease from one colony to another. Honey in brood frames, more specifically honey in brood frames that have been used in the brood box and used for rearing of brood, is likely to have been in that box for some time. This means that it's likely to have been exposed to varroa treatments if you use them. Because of this, I personally never retain the honey for human consumption. I would much rather lose a small amount of honey than risk being embarrassed for having chemicals in my honey. And remember, it's a serious issue if there is a chemical residue in your honey. In some instances, I have uncapped the honey and fed it back to a starving colony. I'm lucky enough, though, to have a freezer that can take full-size brood frames, so generally it sits in there until it's needed. Otherwise, the old mangled frames get cut out, put in the wax melter, separated, and the honey disposed of. Don't be tempted to uncap it and leave it in your apiary to feed back to your bees, though. It encourages bad practice on your part, invites all manner of insects, including other honeybees, into your apiary, and who knows what pests and diseases they may be carrying. Be sensible and be cautious, but use it as an opportunity to replace some of those old frames. Well, that's it for this week. For all of you who haven't yet signed up to my Patreon page, I, together with Steph, have been creating beekeeping content for many years now. And if you're looking for some straightforward, down-to-earth tips and techniques, help and advice, then do take a look at my Patreon page. We have over 1,700 individual beekeeping posts, videos and podcasts, filled with useful and timely help and advice. My approach is pragmatic and calm, sometimes entertaining, but always with help and support for the beekeepers at the heart of what I do. I keep my videos short and concise wherever possible, no waffle, no flannel, just honest beekeeping advice from years of keeping bees. Take a look and join me for the new 2026 beekeeping season. It'll cost you less than a jar of honey, and you never know, there may be something there that will help improve your beekeeping. Check us out online at www.patreon.com/Norfolk Honey.